Hello, my name is David, and I am one of the California certified naturalists that volunteers here at the Discovery Center to help people really have a better appreciation for what is available to them in the forest. It's something that I've been interested in really all my life, and it's been my pleasure over the last 8 or so years to be able to lead these walks. I enjoy personally just getting out and walking around the woods myself, but when I can take a group of people and at the end of it have them say, wow, that was really interesting, or gee whiz, I learned something I didn't know before. It's really a very gratifying experience and something I look forward to doing every week. Welcome everyone. My name is David, and I'll be leading you around our little loop trail up behind the Discovery Center here, which actually starts up at the end of the parking lot, okay? Anyway, when we get on the trail, we're going to make a lot of stops. We'll talk about some of the animals, some of the plants, a little geology, a little history, and if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask, and hopefully I'll know the answer for you. Anyway, before we go up there though, I wanted to point this particular bush out to you. It's a very common plant in this part of the forest. You can see a lot of them behind me and all the way around the parking lot. But for whatever reason, there's none on our trail up there. Anyway, it's got a funny name. You kids will like the name. It's a rubber rabbit plant. Now the rabbit part comes from two things. First of all, you're going to see a lot of nice green plants on this trail, but this is the one thing the rabbits will not eat, okay? But if you look down at the base of it, you can see that it's very dense down there, and the rabbits do like to make their homes underneath there, so the rabbits will live underneath there. That's the rabbit part. Now the rubber part comes from the stem, but if you look here at the top of the stem, you can see this yellow fuzz. That's a remnant of last year's flowers. If you come back in a couple of months, these bushes will be covered with a beautiful yellow flower. They're very pretty. But the stem itself has a very high concentration of latex. And actually, during World War II, it was evaluated as a source of latex to make rubber for tires, but it wasn't commercially viable. So anyway, on that note, we'll head on up to the trail and get started. Well, folks, some of you may have noticed when we first got on the trail a little sign talking about rattlesnakes. Well, we obviously do have rattlesnakes here, but in all honesty, it's nothing to be terribly concerned about. But it is one of the two reasons that we very strongly request that you stay on the trail. Because if you're on the trail, you're going to see them, and if you're wandering around out through the bushes, maybe not so much, okay? The other thing is, a lot of the plants are not terribly keen on being stepped on, okay? Now, one of the things that a lot of people ask about when they first get to the Discovery Center are these big stones that we use as markers around the parking lot and here on the trail. They are a natural stone. It's called quartzite. And if you look down here at the bottom of the rock, you can see where it's very light in color. That's the natural color of the quartzite. When you see the dark brown on the top of it or on the sides of it, that's just surface oxidation, okay? So anyway, on that note, we'll head up to our first actual nature stop. Well, folks, we're going to see a lot of trees like these two on this particular trail. They're western junipers, and I think they're a pretty cool tree. These guys grow very slowly, but they do live for quite a while. We have a couple of them here in the San Bernardino National Forest that we guesstimate are around 2,500 years old. So that makes them our senior citizens, if you will, okay? Now, if you go back 5,000–6,000 years ago, the Serrano Indians, which were our original indigenous people that came up here during the summer to hunt, would sometimes pull off long strips of bark off the tree. You can see a piece I picked up here off the ground, how soft and flexible it is. Anyway, they'd take the long strips and they could weave it into things like fabric and baskets, okay? Now, if you're here later in this year, this tree is going to be covered with little berries. This is an old dried up one from last year that I found on the ground here, okay? The best way I can describe it, they kind of look like miniature blueberries, if you will, okay? They were a significant food source for the Serranos. The birds like them, the squirrels like them. I use them as a spice in the summer. Now, some of the adults here in the group might actually recognize the taste because it's juniper berries that's used to flavor gin. Now, quite obviously, English jennet, the berries are going to come from a different subspecies, but the taste is very much the same, okay? So anyway, this is a plant that provided food for the native people, and then other parts of the plant were useful in other aspects of their life. Now if you look way up over the end of this branch out here, you'll see a green clump growing out there. That is dwarf mistletoe. It is a parasite, and frankly it's not altogether that great for a tree. What it does is it inundates under the bark, and it draws all of its nutrition and water from the tree's circulation. So if you do have a tree that's compromised, like because of drought or disease or overcrowding over a long period of time, it can actually kill a tree, okay? Now it's not always fatal. I mean, I have trees in my yard that have had it for 20 some odd years, and they're basically healthy trees, and they're doing okay with it, okay? There's no way to get rid of it because it's inundated under the bark, so you can't cut it off or pull it off, so it just has to be there, okay? Part of nature. Some of you, I imagine, actually have used mistletoe as a Christmas decoration. And that is an entirely different plant, okay? If you think about what that looks like, it has little tiny leaves about the size maybe of my small fingernail, okay? Now, technically, that's a parasite as well, but what it does is it latches onto a tree branch, and then it supports itself through photosynthesis through those little leaves, okay? So it doesn't really hurt the tree that much. Now we have that growing in this forest as well, and right now you're here at a time where it's kind of hard to see actually. It is an evergreen plant, but normally, like if it's growing in an oak tree, all the oak leaves are out, and so it's remarkably well camouflaged within the tree. If you were here during the winter and you're driving along, you look up in some of the oak trees that have lost their leaves, and you see a big green ball growing up there. That's the mistletoe growing there, okay? Well anyway, on that note, we'll continue on. Folks, the gray-green bushes on both sides of the trail that you've been walking through here is basin sage. Now this is not to be confused with the sage that we use as a spice, okay? If you were to take some of this home and try cooking with it, you'd be pretty disappointed in the results, okay? The little shafts on the top of the green bush, later in the season will be covered with some dull yellow flowers. It's very pretty, okay? Now while it is not a spice, it is essentially edible. I know that the deer like it, especially in the winter when these are the only things sticking up through the snow. And I have been told that the serranos would sometimes take the leaves off of this and make it into what we might consider a medicinal tea. But other than that, it really does not have any particular food value. Now we're going to continue on up the trail here, and I want you to notice that on both sides of the trail, a lot of things have been cut down and put in piles. This is part of a fire protection program the Forest Service is doing all over the United States, and we'll talk about that in some detail towards the end of our walk. Folks, we're also going to see a lot of trees like these two little ones right here. It's a single-leaf pinyon pine, and you can see why it's called that, because the needles, which are the leaves, are coming off the branches one at a time, okay? You know, a lot of you probably have eaten pine nuts in either pasta or salad, okay? Now here's the thing. The seeds from essentially any pine tree are edible, but most of them are really very small. They're very hard to get out of the cones, and then when you get these tiny seeds out of the cone, it's very difficult to get that outer kind of shell off of them, okay? So when you buy pine nuts at a supermarket, what you're getting is seeds from a pinyon pine. Now admittedly, a lot of them are going to be imported, but this is where they're coming from. Now I picked up this cone over here, and you can see on the leaf of the cone these big notches right there. Now that's where the seeds sit, okay? And so that's where your pine nuts come from. Now we're going to pass thousands of these cones along this trail as we walk further, but your chances of finding a cone that have any of the seeds left in it is pretty doggone remote. And I'll show you why. If you go over and look at the very top of that large pinyon right over there, it's up there is where the cones grow, okay? So it's a little cumbersome to get to these. Now, I've been told that the serranos had their own technique for harvesting these, and that is they would take long poles, and right before you got to the point where the cones were opening, they would knock the cones off the tree. They'd fall to the ground, and then they could put those cones next to a fire, and the heat from the fire would basically open the cone up, and they could remove the seeds, and they could get to them, okay? But as difficult as it might be for us to harvest it, It is absolutely no issue whatsoever for the birds and the squirrels to get up there. So by the time these cones get to the point in their life cycle of falling off the tree, basically all of the seeds have been eaten, okay? Now you might have noticed around some of the other trees, like the big juniper right over here, something green growing on those lower branches, okay? Folks, what you're looking at is something called brown-eyed wolf lichen, okay? Now if you look at the end of the shafts on this, it's got little brown circles. They're obviously not eyes, but that's where the name of it comes from, brown-eyed wolf lichen. Now when you touch this, you know, you look at it up in the tree, it looks like it's going to be very soft and so on, but it's actually very hard and stiff, okay? So when you touch this, well, actually what you're feeling is a fungus. And the fungus does just one thing, and that is it attaches to dead wood. That's why you only see it on all these trees growing on the lower branches, which are naturally dead, okay? Now the green on the outside is algae. So this is what's called a synergistic relationship between two organisms, neither one of which would live without the other. The fungus provides a home for the algae, and the algae, through photosynthesis, feeds the fungus, okay? So it's a pretty neat thing. One of the other aspects of the wolf lichen that's pretty cool is it's very sensitive to air quality. It flourishes here in Big Bear, but if you go down to Lake Arrowhead, it doesn't do quite so well down there, okay? Well, let's head on to our next stop. Folks, this bush, or what's left of it here after the Forest Service has done their cleanup work in this area, is a manzanita bush, okay? Now, later on in the summer, this bush is going to be covered with little red berries, okay? They're about the size of the end of my finger, and they kind of look like little red apples. And you know, they taste like little red apples too, okay? So anyway, when the conquistadors came into what is now California in the 1600s, they found these bushes growing over large portions of what is now California. And the indigenous people at that time were eating the berries, and they tried them, and they liked them too. So anyway, that's where the name comes from. It's Spanish for little apple, manzanita, okay? Now, as you walk by the bush, you can feel one of the leaves, and you'll see one side of the leaf is very smooth, and the other side's a little rough. Now, the Serranos would sometimes take these leaves and use the rough side of the leaf to clean their teeth, okay? So this was kind of like the western juniper in that this is a plant that provided food for the people, and then they used other parts of the plant in other aspects of their life. And on that note, we'll move on. Folks, what this sign's talking about are some of the rocks that we've been walking on and around. Excuse me, it's a composite stone from a sedimentary origin. To me, it looks like a piece of broken concrete. You can see all sorts of things embedded in it, okay? Anyway, sedimentary rock basically comes from one primary place, and that's the bottom of the ocean, or a very large lake. And what happens is, over eons of time, things settle to the bottom and then get compressed and formed into stone, okay? Now, the rock I was just holding and showing you, I can't tell you exactly where that rock came from, but I can tell you that if you go back millions of years, where you're standing right now was in fact the bottom of the ocean. And then what happened, the continental plates came together and started pushing up. So what millions of years ago was the bottom of the ocean is now sitting here at 7,000 feet. So it's had kind of a long and interesting journey. But these mountains have had a different journey than most. If you visualize a map of California, the big ranges like the Sierras run basically what you and I would consider north and south, okay? Now originally the San Bernardinos did as well, but as they were being pushed up, the plates here in this area twisted a bit, and they turned these mountains so they run east and west. They're called transverse mountains. They're very uncommon, and particularly for a range this size. But it's this orientation of the mountains that's really responsible for the huge diversity in plant and animal life that we find in this very small national forest. And when I say it's a small national forest, it really is. You know, it borders two others, the Angeles on one side, the Cleveland on the other, and where one stops and the other starts, it can be kind of hard to distinguish. But the San Bernardino National Forest as a standalone entity accounts for only 0.7% of the land in California, so it's not very big. But here's the thing. If you entered the forest, say down by Highland, the elevation coming into the forest there is about 1,400 feet. But it also goes to the highest point in Southern California, the top of San Gorgonio, the big tall mountain with snow on it still over behind the ski resorts. That's 11,500 feet. So there's over a 10,000 foot variation in elevation in this forest. And that has a huge impact on where different plants and animals have the capability of living, okay? But here's the other thing. With this east-west orientation of the mountains, two other things happen. First of all, when a storm comes in off the ocean, it'll hit the Sierras and it's like running into a wall. Well, that doesn't happen here. The storms go right through. So the net effect of that is, from one end of the forest to the other, in different areas, there is a 10-fold difference in precipitation levels. And that's a massive difference in the amount of water available to support plant and animal life in different areas, okay? Now, the other thing is, with this east-west orientation, the sun exposure in this forest is entirely different than it is in the Sierras. If you look behind me or around, you can see that, everybody here would look at this and say, this is a very hot, dry place just looking here. And it is, okay? But I'm looking through the trees, and on the other side of the valley, I'm looking at a ski resort, okay? On that side of the valley, it's cold, wet, and dark, okay? So that's an entirely different ecosystem. Now here's the take-home message from all of this. Between those three elements, elevation, precipitation, and sun exposure, this little tiny forest has 7 distinct ecosystems. Now there's no place else in the United States geographically that small with that many different ecosystems. So you might say, from that standpoint, you're the most diverse place in the country, okay? Now, before we move on, I just want to point out this one tree to you with a curled, twisted trunk that we just walked around. That is a curl leaf mountain mahogany tree. And if you step up here with me, we'll talk about that in a little detail.
David, how many different species of pine and of evergreen trees?
Okay, folks. This is a baby of the curl leaf mountain mahogany tree, okay? And in a way, this is trees like the western juniper, in that these trees live a long time, but they grow very, very slowly, okay? So the life expectancy of this little tree here is around 1,200 years, okay? Now that's kind of cool. But the thing is, if you look over here, you can see the flowers are just beginning to come out on this tree. And as they mature, they turn into little, about that long, fuzzy long shafts that come out, and the entire tree will be covered with these, okay? So at 1,200 years of age, this is the oldest flowering tree that lives in North America, okay? Now I do want to point out something else out to you, and I'm surprised no one's asked about it yet. This is totally and completely unrelated to the mahogany we make furniture out of. That's a different plant, okay? And you'd kind of understand why we don't use it for anything. If you went down to that big tree down there, or there's another pretty good sized one back here, and you tried cutting one of the limbs off of it, you'd find that it's very difficult to do even with a chainsaw. The wood's incredibly hard. But if you did get a section of it out and you took it down to the lake and you put it in the water, the log or the piece of wood you collected there would sink like a rock to the bottom. It's one of the few woods any place in the world that's so dense that it doesn't float, okay? Now, if you go into town and you're visiting with somebody in a local in one of the stores or a restaurant, and you said you were out here in the forest looking at a curl leaf mountain mahogany tree, chances are a lot of them aren't going to know what you're talking about, because most people here call these by a nickname. They call them ironwood, okay? Anyway, all over the country, people in their individual forests tend to call whatever their hardest wood is ironwood. But anyway, in this particular area, the ironwood is curl leaf mountain mahogany trees. So on that note, let's head on. Folks, unfortunately, this is a little early this year for me to show you the flowers, but if you look at this bush straight up the hill here about 15 feet, you'll see it has some dried up flowers on it, okay? That is a flannel bush. And if you were here later in the summer, you'd understand why it's called a flannel bush, because the leaves feel like flannel, just like a flannel shirt, okay? Now those dried up flowers on that bush, when they're in bloom later on, are going to be about this big around, and they're going to be bright yellow. I think it's one of the prettiest, if not the prettiest bush that grows here in the forest. It's like my favorite, okay? Now if you look at the flannel bush just to the left of that one, you'll see that at the bottom of it, it's got a huge pile of sticks. And that's not just a random pile of sticks. That happens to be a wood rat nest. The wood rats are little guys about this long with a fuzzy tail. They're harmless to people, and they're also nocturnal. So anyway, nobody's going to come out and say hi, okay? But anyway, they build these houses generation after generation. So when one family's gone, another will take over and they'll continue to build it. Now, unfortunately, a few years ago, we had one of these down very close to the Discovery Center building that we regrettably did have to remove. And inside the house, we found exactly what we expected to find. These guys are pretty creative architects. There's different rooms inside these houses. One down there had 3 rooms. There was one room they'd obviously use as a dormitory where they'd sleep. They had another room where they'd store their foodstuffs, and they actually had a 3rd room they'd use as a restroom, okay? That's pretty inventive. But you know, here's the thing. Wherever they're living, you know, they build these houses and they always have rooms in it, okay? And so you expect to find that in it. But we also knew that when we took that out, we'd find some things we would not understand and could not possibly explain. And in that house, I know there were a couple of bottle caps, there was a ballpoint pen, some junk, okay? Now, no matter where these guys live, they go around that immediate neighborhood and they find some things that are irrelevant to their life and they bring it and put it in their house, okay? Anyway, so that's how these animals ended up with a nickname. They're called pack rats. So when you've got a neighbor down the street that has a garage full of stuff they've collected for 20 years, they never use and won't get rid of, you say, well, the folks down there are pack rats. That's where the nickname comes from, okay? Anyway, let's head on to our next stop. Folks, before we start talking about what's on this sign, I want to direct your attention up the hill behind you. And on the left side, you'll see a large tree with a big infestation of the dwarf mistletoe we talked about before. And you can look at that tree, and you can see that that tree does not look altogether that healthy. You come back in a couple of years, and chances are very good that tree will, in fact, be dead. You know, there's nothing we can do about it, just a part of nature here, okay? Anyway, what this sign's talking about is the watershed that we're in. And very simply, when we talk about a watershed, we're talking about when it rains here or when there's snow and it melts, where's the water go? We can look over my shoulders and you're going to say, well, obviously it's going to go into the lake, which is certainly true. But I think a lot of you undoubtedly know this is not a natural lake. It was dammed for the first time in the 1880s to provide irrigation water for citrus groves down around Highland and San Bernardino, okay? Just as an aside, in the 1880s, when the dam was built, this was the largest man-made lake in North America. Of course, since then, there have been some things like on the Colorado River that's taken that title away from us. Anyway, before the dam was built, the water would flow through the valley down there, and then down through where the dam is today, and go down Bear Creek to the bottom of the mountain. And at the bottom of the mountain, it joins the Santa Ana River. And the Santa Ana River starts here in this forest as well, way up high on San Gorgonio, the big mountain we talked about before. And from its headwaters up there, it flows for 112 miles to the ocean in a city I'm sure you've all heard of, Huntington Beach, the surfing capital of Southern California, okay? Now, on the other side of the mountain here, obviously the water's going to go that direction. And its first stop in this part of the forest is going to be Holcomb Valley. If any of you have been out to Holcomb Valley, you know it's a very beautiful, large, flat-bottomed valley. And as an aside, it was also in the mid-1800s the place of the gold rush here. This was the second gold rush in California, the second largest gold rush in California, okay? In fact, if you drove out there today or you were hiking up there, you can still find small plots of land here and there, little white stakes in the corner, and those are actual gold claims. It's not commercially viable, but those are things that people do as a hobby. They come up here on a weekend and dig around for some gold, okay? Anyway, the water does not stay in Holcomb Valley. It runs down to the bottom of the mountain, and at the bottom of the mountain, it joins the Mojave River. And the Mojave River flows out through a town in the desert called Barstow. And at that point in time, it's inundating underground, and it's filling the aquifer under the Mojave Desert, providing water for the plants out there, okay? Now, if any of you came into the forest from the Lucerne side, coming up from the desert that way, you know, the edge of the forest is when it's very flat in Lucerne, and then when it first starts going up, that's where the border of the forest is, okay? And at that point on the highway, if you look straight ahead of you, you'd be looking at a mountain that looks like half of it's all cut off, okay? And that's exactly what you're seeing. That is the Mitsubishi Cement Company's calcium carbonate mine, They mine a very low-grade calcium carbonate there and take it down to this massive factory right at the side of the road where they make it into cement, okay? Now, if you stop there for a while and you look way over to the right-hand side of the Mitsubishi mine, you'd see two much smaller mines over there, very small, and both of those mine a very high grade of calcium carbonate. Those are two of the major sources of high-grade calcium carbonate in the United States. And every one of you here today, including the little dog, have all used calcium carbonate already today. If you've taken a vitamin pill, if you've had food fortified with calcium, if you use toothpaste, you've used calcium carbonate. And those are two of the major sources. It is used in literally thousands of consumer products for a myriad of different reasons, okay? At any rate, those are the only mining operations in the San Marino National Forest. And on that note, we'll continue on. Folks, I know that we've talked about the manzanita a little earlier, but I wanted to stop here for a brief minute and just show you this particular section of manzanita. You can see that some of the older plants have died off by the gray skeletons here, and behind that you can see a real overgrowth of pinyon pine. Now, before the Forest Service did their cleanup work down below, this is exactly what that looked like down there. So when we do talk about fire protection work in just a little bit, I want you to keep this picture in mind because this is what we're talking about cleaning up. Okay, let's head on. Folks, this little bush here is a serviceberry bush. And you can see it's covered with little white flowers, okay? Now when these flowers dissipate and they fall off, what's going to be left growing there is a very small berry. And as it ripens, it's going to turn bright red, okay? And as it ripens, they get very, very sweet. So this was really a favorite food for the serranos. The birds like them, the squirrels like them, and I think you'd like them too, okay? Anyway, come the fall, the leaves on this little bush will turn a brilliant yellow, okay? Now I'm going to show you a couple big ones later on in the walk, and you can just imagine if you're here in late October, it looks like a huge, giant yellow balloon growing in the forest, okay? They're very pretty, okay? Anyway, let's head on to our next stop. Folks, you know, as you recall, I mentioned a little while ago that there were 7 distinct ecosystems in this national forest. The one that we're in is a pinyon juniper ecosystem. And if you look out behind me in this ravine, this is more or less what an undisturbed section of this ecosystem would look like. You know, you can look out there and you can see, you know, like a large juniper trees, you can see the pinyon pine, you can see the manzanita, you can see the mountain mahogany trees, you can see the basin sage, you can see the service berries, all of the things that we've been talking about. Now here's the thing. If you go straight across the valley, with the exception of manzanita, you'll find none of these things growing over there. That is a mixed conifer forest over there. Remember, it's cold, wet, and dark over there, okay? It's an entirely different ecosystem. Now you'll see some red trees over there, but they're not the junipers like you're looking at here. Those are incense cedar. There's none around here, okay? You're going to be surrounded by Jeffrey pine. We haven't really seen any on this walk yet, okay? This is kind of out of their territory, okay? Now you'll see some other conifers over there with little short needles on the top of their branches. Those are white fir. You're not finding any of those here. It's a different ecosystem. Now it's not just the plants, but the animals gravitate to these different ecosystems as well. If you were down at the Mitsubishi cement factory and you looked across the highway from that factory, you'd be looking up this very steep, just rocky mountainside, and it would not be terribly unusual for you to see a bighorn sheep there. Well, I can guarantee you could spend the next 50 years here and you'll never see a bighorn sheep up here in this wooded area, okay? It's out of their ecosystem, all right? If you were around the Discovery Center for a while, you might have had a chance at our bird feeders to see like a jay that has a black top knot, okay? That's a stellar jay. Now, I live a couple miles west of here, and the stellar jays are thick around my house, okay? And you see them here at the Discovery Center bird feeders too. But also at the feeders here, you'll see a jay that does not have the black top knot and has a gray underbelly. That's a scrub jay. In 30 years, I've seen a scrub jay in my yard exactly twice. It's absolutely out of their area. They don't like it there, okay? So this is a transition area here. And if you continue going east from here, no more stellar jays, a lot of scrub jays, and then you'll start to see a jay that has a light blue underbelly, and that's a pinyon jay. So anyway, the bottom line is the animals as well as the plants do gravitate to these different ecosystems. Okay? Well, let's move on. Folks, the low-growing green plant that you see on the ground here is right buckwheat, okay? And you can see the little shafts that are coming up out of it. These are leftover from last year. Just a little later on in the summer, it'll get new ones coming up. They're very fine shafts like that and have very pretty little tiny pink flowers on it, okay? Anyway, that's right buckwheat. Folks, if you look at this log, you can see that it's carved, depending on how the sun's hitting it, it's easier to see, but you can see it's carved with a very, very intricate design all over, okay? Personally, I think it's kind of pretty. But actually what caused that is a bark beetle infestation. Now those insects are always here, they're just part of nature basically in almost any forest. They're around us right now, but you wouldn't know it because they're kind of out of sight, out of mind, and not doing any particular harm. But every once in a while, these little things will get totally out of control. And you'll have a massive infestation that can be very dangerous for the forest. Approximately 15 years ago, we had such a thing happen here in the San Bernardino National Forest that killed tens of thousands of trees here that had to be removed, okay? Now here's the thing. Everybody knows that the trunk of the tree, the wood, is dead. The living part of the tree is right outside the trunk, and it's where the bark is, and that's the living part of the tree that grows every year. But it's where the tree's circulation is. It brings water from the roots up to the leaves and nutrition from the leaves down to the roots, okay? And that's what the bark beetles eat. So if they cut that circulation in enough places around the tree, it will kill the tree, essentially starving it to death, okay? Well, let's wander on down the trail a little bit and we'll talk about some animals a little bit larger than bark beetles. Well, folks, you know, I can't really talk about all of the different animals that live here in the forest, but I will make some comments about several of them that people generally ask about, or frequently ask about anyway, when they do visit Big Bear. First of all, up in this corner of the sign, you'll see a picture of a brown bear, which we call a grizzly bear, okay? And in a roundabout way, that's what this valley is named after, Big Bear Valley, okay? But the last grizzly bear, or really brown bear here, was killed in 1923. The last one in California was killed just a couple of years after that in Sequoia, okay? So the only place you find a brown bear, aka grizzly in California, is on the state flag or a zoo, okay? If you go up to Yellowstone National Park, they're along the Canadian border and into Canada and Alaska, they're very common, okay? Other than that, any bear you see in the lower 48 is some subspecies of black bear, like the one pictured here. Now, if in the Discovery Center, before we went on the walk, you might have seen the little bear cub that we've got on display there. It's kind of a light brown in color, okay? But by species, that is a black bear. Black bears are kind of like people. They come in different colors, all right? But the brown bear, or grizzly bears, like up there, are basically always that brown color, okay? Here's the thing though. After 1923, there were no bears here in this valley at all. And in the 1930s, some conservation groups brought down breeding stock of black bear from the high Sierras, placed some here, some down in the Cleveland forest around San Diego, and some in the Angeles forest around Los Angeles. And they have thrived here in Southern California. So right now, here in the San Bernardino forest alone, we've got well over 400 that make it home here. And honestly, they're pretty doggone good neighbors, okay? I can share with you that no one has actually been attacked by a black bear in this valley. But it does happen, and occasionally you'll read about it. I know last summer there was a lady that was very seriously injured up in someplace in Northern California. She was out camping, and she put all of her foodstuffs in the little tent with her. And the bear went, smelled the food, went to get the food, and she got in the way. But I'd share with you that was not the bear's fault. That was her fault. She did something she wasn't really supposed to be doing, okay? You know, they are omnivores, but a majority of their diet, up to 90% of their diet, is vegetation based. And chances are that a majority of the animal protein that they eat is something that they found rather than something that they killed. In this area, that might mean a fish carcass down on the lake shore. It might be a deer carcass that a mountain lion left up here in the woods, okay? It could be your picnic. Or if you were foolish enough, if you were staying up here to leave your trash can out overnight and they attack that and spread it all over the neighborhood, you'd be feeding them as well. People get so angry with the bears for, when they do things like that. But again, it's the people, not the bears, okay? Now, it's not that they can't hunt. They certainly have that capability. They got a set of claws. They could run up that big juniper right over there. They have a massive set of teeth. They have a sense of smell about 7 times better than a dog's. And even they look slow and lumbering as they're walking along, etc. They can sprint at about 30 miles an hour. So if you irritate one of these animals, this is not going to be in your favor, okay? Now, I kind of joke with people sometimes saying if you do encounter a bear and you really want to get your name in the local newspaper here, I can give you a couple of pointers. Try taking a selfie with one, okay? Or if it's a mother with a couple of cubs, go over and try feeding something to the cubs, okay? You'll definitely have your name in the newspaper, but unfortunately for you, it'll be in the obituary column, okay? Anyway, I mentioned deer to you. There's 1,200 mule deer that live here. They're beautiful animals. It is honestly not uncommon at all to see them wandering around right where we're standing here, especially if it's a small group of visitors, okay? Beautiful creatures. This time of year you see a lot more of them because in the winter a lot of them will go down to lower elevations where there's more food for them to eat, okay? I casually mentioned a mountain lion, and they are the antithesis of the black bear. These are dangerous animals. They are the apex predator here. They're very elusive and they cover very large geographic areas, so you can't really count them. But the Forest Service biologists have a formula that feels pretty accurate for estimating the number in an area, and that is that they feel that it takes 100 deer to sustainably support one mountain lion over a long period of time. So knowing that we've got 1,200 deer that live here, they estimate we've probably got about a dozen mountain lions that live here, okay? There's a picture here on this board of a Cooper's hawk. Now, I mentioned 3 bird species to you before. And as I was saying, they all gravitate to different ecosystems here. And then with changing seasons, different birds migrate through these different areas, okay? So depending on where you are in the forest and what time of year it is, there's over 250 different bird species that you might see here in the forest, all right? Now, I can't talk about all the other animals that live here in the forest, but I can share with you that if you just use your imagination and visualize what you might expect to find here, we've got them. We've got the coyote, we've got the bobcat, we've got the fox, we've got the raccoons, we've got the squirrels, we've got the rabbits. All of the usual suspects you'd expect to see in a wooded area, we have them. Folks, if you look right here behind me, you can see a big service berry bush. It's about 15 feet tall. And just imagine if you're here in late October, how incredibly beautiful that would be, okay? Also, if you look over here on the ground underneath that log, you'll see some little remnants of some light yellow fuzz down there. And those are the remnants of last year's flowers that fell off of the mountain mahogany tree right there. Now, I told you we'd spend a little time talking about the fire protection work that the Forest Service is doing. But I want to make a distinction for you. When I'm talking about a forest fire here, I'm talking about a fire in a wooded forested area. I'm not talking about a fire like we just had around Los Angeles, which is in chaparral and grasslands, okay? That's an entirely different beast, okay? But in order to really understand why we have such a problem with forest fires all over North America, you have to go back to about 1900. And at that time, the main conservationists, the naturalists at that time, people like John Muir, President Roosevelt, felt that any fire was a bad thing. And I think that's probably understandable, okay? And they did all they could, including passing laws that encouraged people to not start a fire to begin with, and secondly, to the best of their technology, to put it out if something happened, okay? And that philosophy held until about 1970, and over all those years, the technology for controlling fires got better and better. But it was at that point in time, in the early 70s, that people began realizing this is not a good idea, and it's not working out. And I'll explain to you why. If we went over to the other side of the valley, in the mixed conifer forest over there, and got away from town a little bit, and looked at an acre of land, okay? Well, that forest would naturally burn every 15 to 20 years. And in its natural state, that acre of land we're looking at would have 15, maybe 20 big trees. I'm talking big trees like this, okay? And the canopy from those trees would shade the forest floor, so things had a hard time living underneath there. And then periodically it would burn anyway, and the ash would fertilize the big trees. The whole thing is very sustainable. Well, as we stand on that acre of land over there today, as opposed to 15 really big trees, there's over 1,000 trees on that acre. So that's how much fuel has built up in forests all over North America. And then you take and overlay the effects of climate change on top of that, and we've got, unfortunately, the perfect recipe for forest fires. Now, there's two types of fire protection work the Forest Service does, and this is going to be a gross simplification. But if you look behind me, right over there, and look up this hillside, remember now this is a pinyon juniper ecosystem. One, you can see that the large dead trees have been cut down. The lower branches of the remaining trees have been cut off, and that all of that underbrush that we were looking at further up the trail around that manzanita has been cut out. And all of that debris has been put into piles, and when it's safe to do so, it's been burned to get rid of it, okay? So you look up there right now, and this is actually a pretty fire-protected area. The trees are well separated, they're not that large, and there's no understory to ignite the top of the trees, okay? So this is a pretty doggone fire-safe area we're in right now. So if a forest fire started coming this way, this is where they could stage their firemen and their equipment and stop the fire in this area before, say, it got to the Discovery Center building. On the other side of the valley, remember that's a mixed conifer forest over there. They cannot do this kind of work in that area. Over there, it's a little more laborious. They have to go through and actually thin the forest. They'll send crews in that will remove some of the excess trees. They'll haul the logs out. And after all that's done, then they'll go through and do what's called a broadcast burn on the floor of the forest, which will, number one, when you're walking in the forest over there, you might think you're on ground, but you could be walking on a layer of debris of pine needles and leaves about this thick that's built up over years. It's very flammable, so that all burns off, as well as the underbrush and everything underneath the trees. And it kind of restores it to a more natural state, okay? Now, if some of you came into the forest from Highland, you came up Highway 330 and you went through an area where the line fire went through here last year. And it kind of looks like a moonscape in a way, okay? Anyway, the line fire was burning up the mountain and it was headed towards Big Bear. And when we got to the top of the mountain over here, it reached an area called Bluff Mesa. And about 3 years ago, the Forest Service finished the kind of fire protection work that I was referring to. And at Bluff Mesa, before the fire got there, they were able to stage literally hundreds of firemen, all of their equipment, and focus all of their aerial equipment, fixed wing as well as helicopters on that area. And they were able to stop the fire there where they'd done this fire protection work. And if they hadn't been able to do that, undoubtedly our city over there would have burned. So it's very expensive, very time consuming, but it does work, okay? Folks, a little while ago I mentioned to you that the Jeffrey pine was the most common pine tree in the San Marino National Forest. This is one, there's one right there beside the trail, and there's a couple behind me. But these are really the first ones we've seen on this trail. We're just on the very fringe of where they like to live. But if you look over to the west, you can start seeing the tops of a bunch of them over there, because as you get over that way, a very short distance, you're in a dense Jeffrey forest. And it changes so quickly. You leave our parking lot here and you go across the highway, between the highway and the lake, you're surrounded by a lot of Jeffrey pine. As you continue on this side of the valley, going further east, there's fewer and fewer Jeffrey pine, and they're kind of confined to certain pockets, okay? Before there's none at all, okay? I think it's a pretty neat tree, really. If you come over, especially on a warm summer day where the sun's hitting, and you smell down the cracks of the bark on the Jeffrey pine, it smells like butterscotch or vanilla. Okay, it's really pretty neat, okay? You're welcome to try that on any of these trees if you want. You know, if you go down to drive down to Lake Arrowhead, you're going to go through some pockets of pine that are going to look very, very much like this, but they're not Jeffrey. Those are ponderosa pine, okay? They're very difficult to tell apart until they get larger, and then you can kind of distinguish them by the bark, okay? But a true ponderosa pine has a couple of different characteristics. First of all, this is a cone that I just picked up from a Jeffrey here. Now, I don't know why, but these cones are small on these Jeffreys. They're normally about twice this size. But you can see there's needles down the side of the cone, but I can run my hand down the side of this cone. Now, if this was a ponderosa cone, and they're normally just about this size, and I put my hand next to it, the needles are all sticking out, and it's very sharp, okay? So we call those prickly ponderosa, and these are gentle Jeffrey, okay? Anyway, the ponderosa and the Jeffrey are closely enough related. The lumber industry does not distinguish between the two, and they will cross-pollinate. So an awful lot of the trees here in this forest are a little confused about which they actually are, okay? Anyway, both of them are in the category of pine that are called yellow pine, which really has to do with the color of the lumber that they yield, okay? Now there's two other yellow pine that are very common in the San Bernardino National Forest. One of those is the sugar pine, and those are the pines where the branches go basically straight out, and they have the long cones that hang down from those branches. Now those cones on the sugar pine, you know, about this long, those are the longest pine cones on any tree in the world. The other common yellow pine here is the coulter pine, and they tend to be a little shorter than the others, and they kind of look a little fatter with their foliage, okay? But the cones coming off the coulter are about this big around and about that high, and have very nasty sharpness on the edge of it. And those cones can weigh over 8 pounds when they come off the tree. So those have a nickname. They're called widow makers, if you will. Anyway, those are the 4 common yellow pine that you find in the San Bernardino National Forest. All right? You may have noticed as we've walked along the trail a couple of trees that have had growths like this on the outside. This is not a bad thing. It's not a disease or any problem like that. What's happened is a very long time ago, something injured this tree. And where the bark was cut through, it basically grew this over that cut to protect itself, kind of like a scab, if you will, okay? Now, the serranos would sometimes cut these off the trees and then hollow them out to make a bowl, okay? Now, if you look up over my head, you'll see a house on the side of this tree. And a lot of people glance up there and think they're looking at a birdhouse. But I would share with you that it wouldn't make a very good birdhouse. First of all, there's no floor, and second of all, there's no entrance on the front, okay? What that is, it's actually a bat house. And if you look inside, no one's home right now, but if you look inside, you'll see that there's bars running across horizontally, and the little guys can go up there and hang up there, okay? Now, there's 23 different species of bats that live here in the San Bernardino National Forest. And contrary to some of the bad press they get around Halloween, none of them are harmful to people in any meaningful way. And they're not bad folk at all, okay? Now the one that you usually see at dusk around here is just a common brown bat. They're little guys about this big, and they're wonderful flyers. If we were all on my deck at like about 7:45 at night, they might be flying even between us, zipping around. They'll never run into you. And what they're doing is they're eating the little tiny flying bugs that are so small that we can't even see them unless there's a swarm of them, okay? Now, one of those little bats will eat 1,000 of those bugs a night. And a pregnant female might eat 2,000 to 3,000 in a night, okay? Now, some of the larger bat species eat things like mosquitoes and flies, so they'll play different roles in the environment here, okay? Well, folks, actually, this has been your lucky morning. I didn't have a senior moment, and we found our way back, okay? But anyway, I sincerely want to thank all of you for joining me for this morning's walk. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I hope you have a wonderful time the rest of your stay here in Big Bear. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you went right down when you hit the sidewalk, there's a little arch on the other side.
and you go through that arch, and it's an area